I drove back from Charlotte Douglas International on a Wednesday afternoon in October with a garment bag over the back seat, and the particular kind of tired that comes not from the work itself, but from 3 days of pretending the work is the most important thing in the room. I had been making that drive for 19 years. Regional Operations Director for Hargrove Mechanical, the commercial HVAC contracting company I had built from a two-truck operation in a rented lot on Wilkinson Boulevard into a company with 8 crews, 4 service territories, and contracts with 3 hospital systems across the Carolinas. Trips to Raleigh and Greenville, and sometimes up to Richmond, always 3 or 4 days, always home by Wednesday evening. 19 years of the same pattern. The house on Crestwood Drive with the kitchen light on and Carol's SUV in the garage and whatever she had put in the slow cooker that morning still warm on the counter. I turned onto Crestwood. The garage door was down. The kitchen light was off. I sat in the truck for a moment in the driveway. The October evening was cool, and the neighborhood had the stillness of a Wednesday when the commuters are back inside and the street belongs to nobody. The house looked the same from outside. Same tan brick, same black shutters, same oak tree in the side yard I had been meaning to have trimmed for 2 seasons. Everything in its place. I went to the front door. I unlocked it. I stepped inside. The house was not empty the way a house is empty when the person who lives there has run to the grocery store. It was empty the way a house is empty when the things that made it a home have been systematically removed. The sectional was gone. The armchairs were gone. The photographs Carol had arranged on the hallway wall, across 22 years of marriage, the Christmas cards framed in matching black, the wedding portrait, the beach pictures from the Outer Banks, the grandchildren she had printed and hung with the particular precision of a woman who understood that a wall tells people who you are. All of it was gone. The nails remained. I walked through the living room, through the dining room where the table and 6 chairs were gone, down the hall where the console table and the lamp above it that Carol had found at an estate sale in Waxhaw were gone, to the kitchen where the appliances were still in place, because appliances are fixed, but the cabinet doors had been left open and the shelves were bare. The dishes were gone. The pots were gone. The mason jars she had collected from every state we had ever visited together were gone. I stood at the kitchen counter. There was one thing on it. A manila envelope, the kind used for documents, not letters. My name written on the front in Carol's handwriting. Not Frank, not Honey, not any of the shorthand of a long marriage. Just my full name, Raymond. I stood looking at it for what was probably 2 minutes before I picked it up. If you have known me for more than 5 minutes, you know that I am not a man who leads with feeling. I spent 19 years managing job sites and supply chains and subcontractor relationships and the specific daily friction of a business that runs on deadlines and weather and the reliability of people who sometimes are not reliable. You do not run that business emotionally. You run it by reading what is in front of you and responding to what the facts require. I read what was in front of me. The empty house, the open cabinets, Carol's SUV gone from the garage, which I had not registered when I pulled in because the door had been down and I had not thought to check. She had driven herself away, which meant this was not an accident and not a crisis. It was an exit. I opened the envelope. There were 2 things inside. The first was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten on the personal stationery Carol had used for years, the cream paper with the small navy border. The second was a bank statement, a withdrawal confirmation from our joint savings account at First Carolina Credit Union, dated 9 days earlier, amount $280,000, transferred to an external account I did not recognize at a bank in Scottsdale, Arizona. I set both documents on the bare kitchen counter. I stood in the house I had owned for 17 years, and I thought about the data. What the data said was this: my wife had not left on an impulse. She had not left because of a fight or a crisis, or a moment that broke something that had been holding. She had left on a schedule, at a time of her choosing, after a preparation that had required planning of a kind that takes not weeks, but months, possibly years. What Carol did not know was that I had been reading the data for 16 months. My name is Raymond Coble. I am 63 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the woman who left a manila envelope on my kitchen counter on a Wednesday afternoon in October made a calculation she believed was invisible. She was wrong about that by 16 months and roughly $280,000. I built Hargrove Mechanical with my own hands and my father-in-law's first loan, and a work ethic I had inherited from a man who believed that the quality of what you build is the only argument that matters. I started with residential service calls, 2 technicians, and a service van that broke down twice in the first month. By the time the company was 10 years old, we had moved entirely into commercial work and had signed our first hospital contract. By the time I brought on a operations manager in 2019 and stepped back from daily dispatch, Hargrove Mechanical was billing $4.2 million annually with 31 employees and a reputation in 3 states for never missing a commissioning deadline. I am not telling you this to make myself sound like something I am not. I am telling you because the size of what I had built is directly relevant to what Carol understood she was standing beside when she married me in 2001 and what she concluded she was entitled to when she decided to leave. Carol Ann Whitfield became Carol Ann Coble on a Saturday in May of 2001 at a ceremony in Concord, North Carolina, at the church where her family had worshipped for 3 generations. She was 34. I was 39. We had been together for 2 years, long enough to know each other's habits and short enough to still be surprised by the ones we had missed. She was organized in a way I admired, with the kind of household competence that makes a shared life run without friction. She was warm to the people she chose to be warm to and precise with everyone else, and she had a social confidence I recognized as a genuine skill, the ability to make any room feel like a room she had always belonged in. She ran our home with the same focus I brought to the job sites. For most of our marriage, I had been grateful for that without saying so nearly enough, which is a thing I have had time to reckon with in the months since. We had 2 children. My daughter Lena was 31 and lived in Asheville, where she worked as a nurse practitioner, called me twice a week without fail, and had driven down to Charlotte 3 times in the year before the empty house, without explaining why she was really coming, though I understood it. My son Marcus was 28, lived in Charlotte, worked in property management, and occupied the difficult position of a son who loves both of his parents and does not want to be positioned between them. I did not ask him to choose. I was not going to do that to my son, regardless of what came next. The first thing I noticed was the credit card. Not because I was looking for anything, but because Carol had always managed our household accounts, and I had always trusted her to do so, which is the kind of arrangement that works until it doesn't. In June of 2023, I pulled up our shared credit card statement online for a routine expense reimbursement from the business, and I saw 3 charges I did not recognize. A storage facility on Tyvola Road, a moving consultation service in South Charlotte, a locksmith on Park Road whose service category was listed as residential. I noted them. I did not say anything. They could have explanations. I waited and watched. The second thing was the phone calls. Carol had always been a person who took calls in the kitchen or the living room, in the natural flow of wherever she happened to be. Beginning in the late summer of 2023, calls began moving to the back porch with the door closed, or to the car in the garage with the engine off, or disappeared entirely into the bedroom with the door pulled to. I am not a man who listens at doors. I noted the behavior and continued watching. The third thing was Arizona. Carol had a college friend named Beth who had moved to Scottsdale years earlier, and Carol visited her once a year in the winter, which was consistent and normal, and which I had never thought twice about. In 2023, she went twice. In 2024, she went in January, in April, and then told me in August she was going again in September for what she called a long weekend to decompress before the holidays. The September trip lasted 11 days. She came back with a specific quality I had seen in her before, a kind of settled lightness, the way a person carries themselves when they have somewhere they are moving toward, and the moving is almost done. I noted the quality. I noted Arizona. I noted that Beth's name appeared in conversations about the trips, but that Beth's social media had not been updated since 2021, which is the kind of thing you observe when you are a man who pays quiet attention to data. The fourth thing was the question about the business. In October of 2023, at a Sunday dinner that had seemed like any other Sunday dinner, Carol asked me what I thought Hargrove Mechanical would sell for if I ever decided to sell it. Not in a general wondering way, in a specific way, with follow-up questions about what comparable commercial HVAC companies had been selling for in the Southeast, and whether I had had any formal valuation done recently, and what the multiple on revenue typically looked like for a service business of our size. I answered honestly because I had no documented reason, yet, not to. But I filed the questions in the same place I had been filing the credit card charges, and the phone calls, and the Arizona trips. And the morning after that dinner, I called the only person I trusted completely with what I was beginning to understand. His name is Walt Ingram. We played baseball together at Central Cabarrus High School in 1979 and 1980, and we have been close in the particular way of men who knew each other before they knew anything about themselves. Walt is a retired family law attorney who had a practice in Charlotte for 31 years, and when I called him on a Monday morning and told him what I had been accumulating, he was quiet for longer than Walt is usually quiet. Then he said, "Raymond, the question about the business valuation has a specific legal context. That is the question a spouse asks when they are trying to understand the value of a marital asset in preparation for a divorce proceeding." I said I had considered that. He said, "How long have you been watching this?" I said, "Since June." He said, "You need to be talking to someone who is still practicing. I am going to give you a name. Her name is Patricia Sellers, and she is the best family law attorney in Mecklenburg County, and she will tell you exactly where you stand." I called Patricia Sellers the following morning. I was in her office by Thursday with every business document I could assemble in 48 hours. She was 56 years old, direct in the way that good attorneys are direct, which means she told me the truth before she told me anything comforting. She said North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means that marital property is divided equitably, not equally, but that the distinction matters less than people assume when the marital estate is large and the documentation is incomplete. She said the growth of Hargrove Mechanical during the marriage was potentially a marital asset. She said the key questions were how ownership was structured, what value had existed before the marriage, and what documentation I had to support the distinctions. She said, "Raymond, if your wife has been asking about the business valuation and has been making trips to Arizona with increasing frequency and has been using a storage facility you were not told about, I want to be direct with you. Someone has been planning a departure, and the timing of your legal response to that planning matters enormously." I said, "What do I do first?" She said, "You call your accountant today. You come back to me with complete documentation, and you understand that the joint savings account you mentioned is accessible to either account holder without the consent of the other." I sat with that last sentence for the drive home. I had spent 23 years building what was in that account. I was not going to watch it move to Scottsdale without a record. I did not move the funds. Patricia had been clear that unilateral transfer without proper grounds would damage my position in any proceeding. What I did was open an individual account at a separate institution and begin directing my management salary from Hargrove Mechanical into that account rather than the joint accounts. It was legal. It was documented. Patricia confirmed it was appropriate. I also called my accountant, a methodical man named Gerald Chu, who had handled the company's books since 2009, and I told him what I needed. Gerald is not a man who wastes words. He said, "I'll need 6 weeks and access to everything back to 2001. I said, "You'll have it by end of week." What Gerald and Patricia built over the following 4 months was what Patricia later described as the most complete business asset documentation she had seen from a privately held company in 20 years of practice. We identified the premarital investment, the sweat equity from the years before the marriage became financially entangled with the business, the portions of growth tied to contracts and relationships that predated or were independent of the marital period. We documented the source of every capital contribution. We built a record that told the story of what I had built and when and how, in a language a court could follow without having to guess. By September of 2024, the individual account held $64,000 I had directed there over 9 months. The joint savings account held $280,000 that Carol had been watching and that she would, I would learn, on a Wednesday in October, move 9 days before I came home from Charlotte Douglas. I want to tell you about the letter, because the letter deserves to be described accurately. It was 4 pages in Carol's handwriting, and it was well written, because Carol has always been a capable writer, and because a letter that takes years to compose in one's head tends to arrive on the page in finished form. She said the marriage had become something different from what she had needed it to be, and that she had tried in the ways available to her to address that, and that none of them had reached what needed to be reached. She said she had reconnected with someone she had known a long time ago, and that it had clarified things she had been uncertain about for years. She said she was not asking for my understanding because she knew she had not earned it. She said the attorneys would handle the financial matters, and that she hoped we could reach a resolution that did not require extended conflict. She said she was sorry. She said it twice. She said she hoped I would be all right. She said she had always known I would be. I read the letter once. I set it beside the bank statement. I picked up my phone and I called Patricia Sellers at 5:51 on a Wednesday evening. She answered before the second ring. She said, "Raymond." I said, "Patricia, she left today. The house is empty. She moved $280,000 out of the joint savings account 9 days ago. I have the confirmation in front of me." A brief pause. Then she said, "Are you at the house?" I said I was. She said, "Photograph everything. Every empty room, every open cabinet, the envelope, the letter, the withdrawal confirmation. Do it now while we are talking." I was already doing it. She said, "I am filing a motion tonight. The transfer to an external account in anticipation of a divorce filing is exactly what we built the record to address. Raymond, I have to tell you something. In the 16 months we have been working on this, I have been preparing for this specific moment. The documentation is complete. The business valuation is clean. The premarital contribution analysis is clean. The earnings redirection is documented with a complete paper trail. We are ready." I said, "I know." She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm functional." "That's what's available right now." She said, "That's enough. I'll have the motion filed by 9. Call me in the morning." I spent an hour photographing every room. What I noticed in the bedroom was that Carol had taken her clothes from the closet and her things from the bathroom, but had left the closet on my side untouched. She had packed incrementally, I realized, not in one concentrated effort, but a little at a time, over weeks, the way a tide goes out, gradually enough that you do not notice the waterline dropping until the rocks beneath are showing. The house had been emptied, the way every deliberate thing is done, slowly and without drama, and not visible until it was finished. I called Lena from the empty living room. She picked up on the first ring. I told her what I had come home to. She was quiet for 5 seconds, which for Lena is a long time. Then she said, very evenly, "Dad, how long did you know?" I said, "I started watching 16 months ago. I have been working with an attorney since November of 2023. She said, "You didn't say anything." I said, "There was nothing useful to say until there was something useful to do. I needed to be ready before the situation arrived, not after it." Another pause. Then she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm clear." She said, "I'm putting my shoes on." I said, "Lena, it is a 90-minute drive." She said, "I know how long it is. Is there food in the house?" I looked at the kitchen with its open cabinets and its bare shelves. I said, "Not currently." She said, "I'll stop at that barbecue place you like on Tunnel Road. Don't do anything until I get there." She arrived at 8:47 with a bag of food and her particular quality of steady, which she has always had and which I have never once taken for granted. She walked through the empty house with me without saying much at first, room by room, present in the way that certain people know how to be present in difficulty without making the difficulty larger than it already is. She stopped in the living room and looked at the bare walls with the nail holes, and she said, "It's just a house, Dad. You built what matters." I said, "I know that." She said, "Tell me where things stand with Patricia." I told her. I told her about the motion, the documentation, the business valuation record, the earnings redirection with its paper trail, the withdrawal confirmation, and what Patricia believed it established. Lena listened the way she listens in a clinical setting, with complete attention and without interruption. When I finished, she said, "You've been carrying this for 16 months. I said, "I've been working it for 16 months. That is different." She looked at me in the way she has looked at me since she was about 12 years old, the look that says she sees more than I am giving her credit for, which is usually accurate. She said, "Dad, you were married to her for 22 years. You came home to this." She gestured at the empty room. "You're allowed to feel that." I said, "I will. I'm choosing to be useful right now. The rest will be there when the useful part is done." She nodded. She said, "Mom used to say you were the most prepared person she had ever met." I said, "Your mother was smarter than either of us." Lena said, "She also knew when to put the clipboard down." I said, "That is a fair point." She said, "Not a criticism." I said, "I know." We sat on the floor of the empty living room because there was nowhere else to sit, and we ate barbecue out of containers with plastic forks and talked past midnight about things that mattered and some that didn't, and at some point the empty house stopped feeling like a crime scene and started feeling like a house that needed furniture, which is a problem with a solution, and I am a man who prefers problems with solutions. The proceedings took 9 months. Patricia Sellers is what Walt Ingram told me she would be, and Walt Ingram has never once steered me wrong in 45 years. The documentation Gerald and Patricia had built became the architecture of everything that followed. The business valuation, the premarital contribution analysis, the earnings redirection with every transfer dated and sourced, the evidence of the joint account withdrawal and the external account, and the 9-day interval between that withdrawal and the divorce filing, all of it formed a record that told a coherent story about what had happened, and when and why it mattered, legally. Carol had retained an attorney in Scottsdale whose name I will not use, and who was competent, but who walked into a room where the work had already been done and the record was already built. The central contest was the withdrawal. $280,000 moved 9 days before filing to an account in Arizona tied to a man named Stephen Garland, 58 years old, commercial developer, graduate of the same Charlotte high school Carol had attended, who had appeared in her life through an alumni event in 2020, and whose connection to the Arizona trips I had documented carefully enough that Patricia described it as the clearest dissipation timeline she had brought into a courtroom in her career. The court found that the transfer constituted dissipation of marital assets. The funds were ordered returned to the marital estate. A portion went to Carol in the equitable distribution because North Carolina law entitled her to it. A portion came to me. The net outcome was not without cost, because no contested proceeding is without cost, but it was a result built on an accurate record rather than a position of surprise and disadvantage, which is what it would have been without 16 months of quiet preparation. I want to tell you about one moment in the proceedings, because it is the moment the story is actually about underneath the documents and the motions and the legal architecture. In May of 2025, during a deposition at Patricia's office, Carol's attorney asked me when I had first believed a divorce was being planned. I said June of 2023. He asked what had led me to that belief. I described the storage facility charges, the shifting phone behavior, the frequency of the Arizona trips, the conversation about the business valuation. He asked if there had been anything else. I said yes. I said in September of 2023, I had become aware through publicly available information of a connection between Carol and a man named Stephen Garland, and that the geographic overlap between that connection and the Arizona account destination had confirmed what I had already suspected. The room was quiet. Carol was seated across the conference table from me, the first time we had been in the same room since the Wednesday in October. I had not looked at her directly since we sat down. I looked at her now. She was looking at a point somewhere between the table and the wall. Her attorney said, "No further questions on that topic." I looked at Patricia. She made no expression, which is what she does when something has gone precisely as she expected. What had happened in that room was the thing the 16 months had been building toward, not the documents themselves. The moment when the person who had believed she was the architect of what was coming understood that the architecture had been bilateral. She had believed she was managing a situation. She had been inside a situation that had already been mapped. The settlement was finalized in August of 2025. The house on Crestwood Drive was sold, and the equity split. I bought a house in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte, a 1950s brick ranch with a covered back porch and a detached garage. I have been converting into a proper workshop, which is work that moves at its own pace and rewards patience, which suits me. Lena comes down from Asheville once a month. Marcus comes for dinner on Sundays when his schedule allows. Walt Ingram came over on a Saturday in September with his truck and helped me carry the new workbench I had built from a design I had been drawing on graph paper for the better part of a month into the garage workshop which is the kind of thing a man who has known you since you were 17 does when you need a hand and have not asked for one, because he has known you long enough to know when showing up is the right response. I have been thinking about something Lena said the night she drove down from Asheville, sitting on the floor of the empty living room. She said, "It's just a house, Dad." She was right. The sectional Carol took, the photographs from the hallway wall, the mason jars from every state, all of it was replaceable. What was not replaceable, the company I had built, the documented record of what I had built and how, the house equity, the relationship with my children, all of it was intact, not because of fortune. Because I had spent 16 months making sure it would be. There is something I have not told you yet, because I needed you to understand the shape of this story before I added the weight of it. My wife before Carol was a woman named Ruth. Ruth Coble died in 2007 from an illness that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. Lena was 13. Marcus was 10. I have not remarried since, because I understand now that I remarried too soon, and with incomplete knowledge of what I was carrying from that loss, and that incomplete knowledge shaped a marriage that deserved better preparation than I gave it. I am not excusing Carol. What she did was deliberate, and it was unkind. But I understand that a man who loses someone without warning learns to prepare for everything afterward, because the one thing he failed to prepare for nearly undid him. When Ruth died, I had no plan. I had no record. I had 2 children and a business and a grief that I managed by working harder than was probably healthy and never once setting down the clipboard. I was not going to stand in another empty room with nothing in my hands. So I built the record. I built the documentation. I prepared for the situation that was developing, regardless of whether I was ready for it, because readiness was the one thing I could still control. My father used to say that a man who is surprised by something he could have seen coming made a choice not to look. He was a hard man to argue with on that point. I looked. I kept looking for 16 months. And on a Wednesday evening in October, when I stood in a kitchen with open cabinets and a manila envelope in my hands and a wire confirmation for $280,000, what I found was not just evidence of what Carol had done. I found confirmation that the 16 months had been sufficient, that the work had been enough, that I was not standing there with nothing. That is the specific kind of document worth holding, not the one that tells you what someone else was building against you, the one that proves what you had already built. The workshop in Dilworth is taking shape. The bench is solid. The tools I brought from Crestwood fill the wall the way I planned them to fill it. Sunday mornings I go out there early before Marcus arrives, and I stand in the quiet with a cup of coffee, and I think about what I am building next. There is always something being built when you are a man who has spent his life understanding that the quality of what you construct is the only argument that survives. The current project is a set of shelves for the back wall. Good lumber, correct joinery, built to hold weight. That is what you do after. You build something that holds. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit closest to home. Hit that like button if this is the kind of story that belongs on your feed, and subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. I will see you then.